They say physical intimacy can heal wounds, but what happens when it only deepens them? In that fleeting moment with Daniel, when skin met skin and whispered promises were exchanged, I thought we could rebuild what we lost. But passion can't mask the fractures of the past, and now I'm left to wonder. Was it love, or just one last goodbye? Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The room felt colder than it should have. The morning light seeped through the blinds, casting pale streaks across the floor of my apartment. I sat curled up on the couch, holding a mug of lukewarm coffee in my hands, staring blankly at the wall. It wasn't the kind of staring you do when you're deep in thought. No, it was the kind where your brain is too tired to think, too cluttered to process anything. Daniel had left before dawn again. I'd heard the quiet click of the door as he slipped out, his footsteps fading down the hallway. No goodbye. No explanation. Just the lingering emptiness that came every time he walked away. I told myself I was used to it, but the ache in my chest told a different story. Max, my golden retriever, padded over to me and rested his chin on my knee, his warm brown eyes looking up at me as if to say, I'm here. It's okay. His fur glistened in the soft morning light, his steady breathing a reminder that I wasn't completely alone. I reached out and ran my fingers through his coat, finding some semblance of comfort in his silent companionship. Hey buddy, I whispered, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. Max wagged his tail lightly, his way of telling me that no matter what, he wasn't going anywhere. I let out a deep sigh and leaned back into the couch, letting the quiet of the apartment settle around me. It was a strange kind of quiet, not peaceful but heavy, like the air after a storm that never really left. The space felt too big, too empty, like it had been built for something that didn't exist anymore. There had been a time when this apartment felt like home. When Daniel and I moved in, I'd been so full of hope, so certain that we were building something together. Now, it felt more like a hollow shell, a place where we coexisted but never truly connected. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching into an eternity. I glanced at the kitchen table where Daniel's coffee cup still sat, untouched. He hadn't even taken the time to drink it before leaving. That small detail stung more than I cared to admit. Max nudged my hand with his nose, pulling me out of my spiraling thoughts. He tilted his head, his ears perking up in that way that always made me smile. You're right, I murmured. No use sitting here feeling sorry for myself. But even as I said the words, they felt hollow, like I was trying to convince myself of something I didn't believe. I set the mug down and stood up, stretching my stiff limbs. Max wagged his tail and trotted to the door, looking back at me expectantly. You want to go for a walk? I asked. His excited bark was all the answer I needed. The cool air hit my face as we stepped outside, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of relief. The world outside was moving on, indifferent to the weight I carried inside. Max bounded ahead, his tail wagging furiously as he sniffed at every bush and tree. I followed him, my steps slow but steady, letting the rhythm of the walk calm my racing thoughts. As we reached the park, I looked around at the families playing, the joggers passing by, the couples sitting on benches, lost in conversation. It was a strange feeling, being surrounded by so much life when I felt so disconnected from my own. Max barked and tugged at the leash, pulling me toward the pond. I laughed despite myself, his energy breaking through the fog in my mind. All right, I said, following his lead. For a moment I let myself forget. Forget the empty apartment, the unanswered questions, the silence that had grown between Daniel and me. For a moment it was just me and Max, the cool breeze, and the quiet hum of the park. The mornings always started the same. I'd get up, let Max out into the tiny patch of grass behind the apartment, and watch him wag his tail as if the whole world was full of reasons to be happy. For him, maybe it was. A sniff here, a squirrel there, his life was simple. Mine, not so much. Today, I stood by the door longer than usual, my coffee mug warm in my hands, watching Max nose through the leaves. The golden sunlight streamed through the trees, but instead of feeling its warmth, I just felt tired. Tired of pretending everything was okay. Tired of waiting for answers that Daniel seemed unwilling or unable to give. Max barked once, breaking my thoughts. He turned to me, his tail wagging as if to say, "Come on, let's go." "All right, buddy," I said, forcing a smile. "Let's get moving." The streets were quiet this early, just the way I liked them. I walked the same route every day with Max, past the rows of small, weathered houses and the cafe on the corner that always smelled like fresh pastries. Max loved it here, tugging at his leash to sniff every lamppost and flower bed. I kept my head down, watching my feet move one in front of the other. The rhythm of walking had always been calming, a way to drown out the noise in my head. But today even that wasn't working. My mind kept drifting back to Daniel, to the empty coffee cup he'd left behind this morning, to the growing silence between us. It wasn't just the lack of words. It was the way he avoided eye contact, the way he always seemed to be somewhere else, even when he was sitting right next to me. I didn't know how to reach him anymore, or if he even wanted me to. Max barked again, this time tugging me toward the park. I sighed and followed him, letting him take the lead. He was always so sure of where he wanted to go. I envied that. The park was alive with its usual hum. Children laughing, joggers pounding the trails, birds chirping in the trees. It was a stark contrast to the heaviness I felt inside. Max, oblivious to my mood, pulled me toward the pond where he loved to chase the ducks. I laughed despite myself, his energy infectious. As I watched him dart around, a voice pulled me out of my thoughts. "Beautiful dog you've got there." I turned to see a woman standing a few feet away, her own dog, a scruffy little terrier, sitting obediently at her side. She was younger than me, maybe mid-20s, with a bright smile and a relaxed air about her. "Thanks," I said, trying to match her smile but falling short. "This is Max. He's gorgeous," she said, crouching down to get a better look at him. Max, ever the attention seeker, bounded over to her, tail wagging furiously. "What's his name?" I asked, nodding toward her dog. "Pepper," she said with a grin. "She's a handful, but I wouldn't trade her for anything." We chatted for a while, exchanging stories about our dogs and laughing at their antics. Her name was Ellie, and there was something refreshing about her, an openness I hadn't encountered in a long time. She didn't pry or ask about the heaviness in my voice, and I was grateful for that. By the time we said goodbye, I felt lighter, as if the weight I'd been carrying had shifted, if only for a moment. The apartment felt the same as it always did, quiet, empty, and too big for just me and Max. I set my keys on the counter and looked around, taking in the familiar sights. The couch where Daniel used to sit, the kitchen where we used to cook together, the framed photo on the wall of us smiling on the day we moved in. I felt a pang of longing for what used to be, but it was quickly replaced by a wave of frustration. I couldn't keep living like this, stuck in the past, waiting for something to change. Something had to give. Max trotted over and nudged my leg, his eyes full of concern. I knelt down and wrapped my arms around him, burying my face in his fur. "What would I do without you, huh?" I whispered. He didn't answer, of course, but his warm presence was enough, for now at least. That afternoon, I found myself back at the cafe on the corner. I ordered a latte and sat by the window watching people go by. It was something Daniel and I used to do together, but today I was alone. And maybe that was okay. As I sipped my coffee, I pulled out a notebook I hadn't used in months. Writing had always been my escape, a way to sort through the mess in my head. I didn't know what to write at first, so I started with the basics. A list of things I wanted, things I needed. The words stared back at me, raw and honest. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a direction, even if it was just a small one. Max rested his head on my lap, his tail wagging gently. I scratched behind his ears, a soft smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "Maybe we'll be okay after all," I said, more to myself than to him. And for the first time I almost believed it. It was another quiet morning, the kind that dragged on and blended into every other day. I had been avoiding the living room, not wanting to see Daniel's coffee cup still sitting on the table or his jacket draped over the chair. Instead, I focused on Max, who seemed particularly restless. "All right, let's go," I said, grabbing his leash. His ears perked up immediately, and he bounded toward the door, tail wagging furiously. At least one of us was excited about the day. The park was unusually lively when we arrived. Max tugged on the leash, practically dragging me toward the pond where a group of ducks had gathered. I followed, half smiling at his determination, when suddenly he stopped short and barked. I looked up to see another dog bounding toward us, a scruffy terrier with floppy ears and a wagging tail. Behind the dog came a young woman, jogging to catch up. "Pepper," she called, exasperation mixing with laughter as she finally reached us. "Sorry about that. She thinks everyone is her best friend." Max seemed unfazed by Pepper's enthusiasm, sniffing her cautiously before wagging his tail in approval. I laughed despite myself. "It's okay. Max isn't exactly shy either." The woman smiled, brushing a stray lock of hair out of her face. "I'm Ellie," she said, extending a hand. "And this troublemaker is Pepper." "Sophia," I replied, shaking her hand. "And that's Max. He's my partner in crime." Ellie crouched down to ruffle Max's ears. "He's beautiful," she said sincerely. "Golden retrievers have such great energy." "Thanks," I said, feeling a strange warmth at her kindness. "Pepper's adorable too. She's got that mischievous look." "Oh, she's a handful," Ellie admitted, laughing. "But I wouldn't trade her for anything." Ellie and I ended up walking our dogs together around the park. She was easy to talk to, open, friendly, and refreshingly free of judgment. We chatted about everything and nothing, from dog quirks to our favorite coffee shops. I found myself laughing more than I had in weeks, something that felt foreign but welcome. "So, do you live nearby?" Ellie asked as we approached a bench to sit down. "Yeah, just a couple of blocks away," I said, gesturing vaguely. "It's a quiet place." Ellie nodded knowingly, as if she understood the weight behind my words. "Sometimes quiet can be good," she said, "but it can also be lonely." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I looked down at Max, who was sprawled out contentedly in the grass, completely at ease. "Yeah," I said softly. "It can be." There was a pause, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Ellie had a way of filling the silence without needing to say anything. It was a quality I hadn't realized I'd been craving. "You know," she said after a moment, "Pepper and I come here every morning. If you ever feel like some company." I glanced at her, surprised by the offer. She smiled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't hesitate. "I'd like that," I said. When I got home, the apartment felt a little less empty. Max trotted in happily, his tail wagging as he flopped onto the rug. I stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it all in. It wasn't much, but today had felt different. Better. I walked over to the coffee table and picked up Daniel's cup. It was cold now, untouched. For the first time, it didn't fill me with anger or sadness. It just was. I rinsed it out in the sink and put it away. A small but significant act of reclaiming my space. As I sat down on the couch, Max climbed up beside me, resting his head on my lap. I scratched behind his ears, thinking about Ellie and how easy it had been to talk to her. It wasn't like me to open up to strangers, but something about her felt safe, familiar. "Maybe this is a good thing," I murmured to Max. He thumped his tail in agreement. That evening, I pulled out my notebook again. I flipped to the page where I'd written my list of goals and added a new line. It was a small step, but it felt important. I didn't know where it would lead, and maybe that was okay. For now, it was enough to know that I wasn't completely alone, that there were people like Ellie, who might be willing to walk alongside me even if just for a while. As the sun set and the room grew darker, I didn't feel the same heaviness that usually crept in. Instead, there was a flicker of hope, small but real, and for the first time in weeks I believed it might grow. The apartment was quiet again, the kind of silence that seeped into the walls and made the air feel heavy. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the blank page in my notebook, my pen hovering above it like it might write something on its own. I was supposed to be making progress. Ellie's invitation to join her at the park again had given me something to look forward to, something that felt like a step toward rebuilding. But now, sitting here, the weight of everything I hadn't dealt with pressed down on me like a stone. The notebook sat open on the table, but my mind drifted elsewhere, to the day Daniel and I first moved into this apartment. It had been so full of promise, the kind of day you look back on with rose-colored glasses even when you know better. I could almost hear his voice, light and teasing, as he unpacked the boxes. "This is going to be our fresh start. Sophia," he'd said, holding up a set of mismatched mugs with a grin. You, me, and all the caffeine in the world. Back then it had felt true. We'd been a team full of hope and possibility. But somewhere along the way that feeling had slipped through our fingers. Now those mugs sat unused in the cabinet, collecting dust along with all the plans we never followed through on. Max padded into the kitchen, his nails clicking softly against the tile floor. He sat down beside me, his head tilted as if to say, "What's wrong?" His golden fur caught the afternoon light streaming through the window, and I reached down to scratch behind his ears. "You're the only one who hasn't let me down," I said quietly, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. Max leaned into my hand, his tail thumping gently against the floor. He didn't know how much those little gestures meant to me, how his constant presence kept me from drowning in the quiet. The truth was I hadn't let go of Daniel. Not really. Even when I told myself I was ready to move on, there was a part of me that still clung to the idea of what we used to be. It was like trying to hold on to water. No matter how tightly I gripped, it kept slipping through my hands. As if on cue, my phone buzzed on the counter. My heart skipped a beat, a reaction I hated but couldn't seem to control. I reached for it, already knowing it wasn't him. It never was. Instead it was Ellie, her name lighting up the screen with a cheerful message. "Park tomorrow morning? Pepper and Max need their playdate." I smiled despite myself, the warmth of her words cutting through the heaviness in my chest. I texted back a quick "sounds perfect" before setting the phone down. It wasn't Daniel, but maybe that was okay. Maybe it was better. Later that evening I found myself standing in front of the hallway closet, staring at the box I'd shoved there months ago. It was full of things that belonged to us, to Daniel and me. I had told myself I'd go through it eventually, but I never had. Max sat beside me, his head resting on his paws as if he knew this was something I needed to do alone. Taking a deep breath, I opened the box. The first thing I saw was a photo. It was from our first anniversary. Daniel and I smiling on a beach somewhere, the sun setting behind us. I traced the edges of the frame with my finger, feeling the sharp pang of loss in my chest. Underneath the photo were scraps of memories. A ticket stub from our first concert, the menu from the restaurant where he'd proposed, a handful of notes we'd written to each other over the years. Each item was a reminder of who we used to be, a version of us that felt so far away now. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I didn't fight them. For once I let myself feel the grief, the anger, the disappointment. It wasn't just about losing Daniel, it was about losing the person I had been when we were together. When I finally closed the box, my hands were shaking, but there was a strange sense of relief too. I wasn't ready to throw it all away, not yet, but facing it felt like a step forward. Like I was finally beginning to accept that those memories were part of my story, but they didn't have to define me. I carried the box back to the closet, but instead of shoving it out of sight, I placed it neatly on the top shelf. It was still there, but it didn't feel as heavy anymore. Max wagged his tail as I turned to him, his eyes full of quiet encouragement. "You're right," I said, scratching his head. "One step at a time." That night, as I lay in bed, I stared at my phone on the nightstand. A part of me still hoped for a text or a call, even though I knew better. I hated how much power that tiny device had over me, how it made me feel like I was waiting for something that might never happen. But as the minutes turned into hours, I realized something. I wasn't really waiting for Daniel. I was waiting for myself, for the part of me that had been lost in all of this to finally come back. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves. I tugged my scarf tighter around my neck as Max trotted ahead, his golden fur gleaming in the soft sunlight. The park was quieter than usual, with only a few scattered joggers and the distant hum of birdsong breaking the silence. It felt like a good day to start fresh. Ellie was already waiting by the pond when we arrived. Pepper sat obediently at her feet, her tail wagging as soon as she spotted Max. Ellie waved, her bright smile a stark contrast to the heaviness that had clouded my days lately. "Good morning," she called as we approached. "Max looks like he's ready to conquer the world." I laughed softly. "He's always ready. I just follow his lead." As the dogs played by the water, Ellie and I strolled along the path, the sound of their paws splashing breaking up the stillness around us. I found myself relaxing in her presence, the ease of our conversation soothing in a way I hadn't expected. "So," Ellie said, glancing at me with curiosity, "how's life treating you? You seemed a little, I don't know, weighed down the last time we talked." I hesitated, unsure of how much to share. But something about Ellie made it easy to be honest. "It's been hard," I admitted. "Things with Daniel have been strained for a long time, and I'm starting to realize I've been waiting for him to change. But I don't think he will." Ellie nodded thoughtfully, her expression sympathetic but not pitying. "That's tough. Letting go of someone you love, or used to love, is never easy. But sometimes holding on hurts more." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I looked down at Max, who was happily chasing Pepper, oblivious to the weight of the conversation. "I've spent so much time trying to fix things," I said softly. "But I don't even know what I'm holding on to anymore." Ellie placed a gentle hand on my arm. "Maybe it's time to focus on yourself for a while. Figure out what makes you happy." I nodded, the idea settling in my mind like a seed. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was time. After saying goodbye to Ellie and Pepper, Max and I headed back home. The walk felt different this time, lighter. Like the weight I'd been carrying was starting to shift. Max seemed to sense it too, bounding ahead with renewed energy, his tail wagging furiously. When we reached the apartment, I set down Max's leash and stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the familiar surroundings. The couch, the coffee table, the framed photo on the wall, all of it felt like pieces of a life I no longer fit into. I walked over to the photo and took it down. It was a picture of Daniel and me smiling on a beach, our arms wrapped around each other. I traced the edges of the frame, memories of that day flooding back. It had been a good day. But it was just one day, and it didn't define who I was now. Placing the photo face down on the table, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let the past hold me captive anymore. It was time to start building something new. That afternoon, I cleaned the apartment from top to bottom. I boxed up the things that reminded me of Daniel. The books we'd bought together, the knickknacks we'd collected on trips, even the coffee cup he never used. Each item felt like a small weight lifted off my shoulders, a step closer to reclaiming the space as my own. Max watched from his spot on the couch, his head resting on his paws. Every now and then, he'd wag his tail as if cheering me on. When I was finished, the apartment felt different. It wasn't empty, it was open, like there was room for something new. That evening, I found myself at the local florist. I hadn't planned on buying anything, but as I walked past the rows of fresh blooms, a vibrant bouquet of sunflowers caught my eye. Their golden petals seemed to radiate warmth, a stark contrast to the grayness I'd been living in. Without thinking, I picked them up and brought them home. I placed them in a vase on the kitchen table, their cheerful presence brightening the room. It was a small thing, but it felt significant, a symbol of change, of hope. Max sniffed the flowers curiously, his nose twitching as he inspected them. "They're nice, huh?" I said, scratching behind his ears. He wagged his tail in agreement. As the sun set, I sat on the couch with Max curled up beside me, his steady breathing a comforting rhythm. I opened my notebook and flipped to the page where I'd started my list of goals. Find my voice. Learn to let go. Stop waiting for Daniel to come around. I added a new line, choose joy. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward. It wasn't a big step, but it was mine. And that was enough. The morning started like any other. I had just finished my second cup of coffee when Max nudged me toward the door, his leash dangling from his mouth. All right, I said, laughing as I grabbed the leash from him. "You're getting bossy these days." The park was busier than usual, the paths crowded with joggers and families enjoying the crisp autumn air. Max led the way as always, his nose twitching at every scent, his tail wagging in excitement. I let him pull me toward the pond, where he loved to watch the ducks. It was peaceful, or at least, it should have been. I didn't notice him at first. My focus was on Max, who was barking excitedly at a flock of ducks, his tail wagging like crazy. But then I heard the voice, a low, familiar timbre that sent a jolt through my chest. "Is that you, Sophia?" I turned, my breath catching in my throat. There he was, Daniel, standing just a few feet away. His hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket, his blue eyes scanning my face like he wasn't sure if he was seeing a memory or the real thing. For a moment I couldn't speak. The last time I'd seen him, he'd walked out the door without a word, leaving behind nothing but questions I'd never been able to answer. And now here he was, standing in front of me like no time had passed. "Daniel," I said finally, my voice steadier than I expected. "What are you doing here?" He shrugged, the corners of his mouth lifting in a weak attempt at a smile. "I've been staying with a friend nearby. Thought I'd take a walk. Didn't expect to run into you." "Right," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "Small world." Max, sensing the tension, came to stand by my side, his big brown eyes fixed on Daniel. For once he wasn't wagging his tail. "You look good," Daniel said, his voice quiet. "Happy." The words stung, not because they were untrue, but because they came from him, the person who had left me to figure out how to be happy on my own. "I'm getting there," I replied, crossing my arms. "What about you?" Daniel hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I'm working on it." The silence that followed was thick, filled with all the things we weren't saying. I wanted to ask him why he'd left, why he hadn't fought for us, why he'd let me carry all the weight of our broken relationship. But the words caught in my throat. Maybe I didn't need those answers anymore. "I should go," Daniel said eventually, his voice heavy with something I couldn't quite name. Regret, maybe. Or relief. "It was good to see you." "You too," I said, though I wasn't sure if it was true. As he turned to leave, Max let out a soft whine, almost as if he could feel the weight of the moment. I knelt down and scratched behind his ears, grounding myself in his steady presence. "It's okay, boy," I murmured. "We're okay." And we were. At least I thought we might be. After Daniel was gone, I stayed at the park longer than usual. Max seemed to sense that I needed the extra time, his playful energy replaced by a calm, steady presence. We walked the paths in silence, the crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound between us. I couldn't stop replaying the encounter in my head. Seeing Daniel again had stirred up emotions I thought I'd buried, anger, sadness, longing. But there was something else too. A sense of clarity, of finality. For so long I had been waiting for him to come back, to give me the closure I thought I needed. But now that he had, I realized something. I didn't need his answers to move on. I had already begun to let go. When we got back to the apartment, I sank onto the couch, Max hopping up beside me. His head rested on my lap, his warm presence anchoring me as I sorted through the whirlwind of emotions the day had brought. I reached for my notebook and flipped to the page with my goals. The list stared back at me, a reminder of the promises I had made to myself. Find my voice. Learn to let go. Stop waiting for Daniel to come around. Choose joy. I picked up my pen and added a new line. Embrace the unexpected. Life had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected them. Running into Daniel was one of them. But it didn't have to derail me. If anything, it was a reminder of how far I'd come, and how much further I wanted to go. Max let out a contented sigh, his tail thumping softly against the couch. I scratched behind his ears, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "We're doing okay, aren't we?" I said quietly. Max wagged his tail in agreement, and for the first time that day, I felt a sense of peace. The morning light filtered through the blinds, warming the room in soft golden hues. Max was already awake, sprawled on the couch with his head resting on the armrest. His tail thumped lazily when he saw me walk in, coffee mug in hand. "Another day, another adventure, huh?" I said, scratching behind his ears. He wagged his tail in agreement, his eyes bright with anticipation. Today felt different, lighter somehow. Running into Daniel at the park had shaken me, but it had also clarified something I hadn't been able to admit before. I was ready to move on. Not just from him, but from the version of myself that had clung so tightly to what we once had. At the park, Ellie was already waiting by the pond, her scruffy terrier, Pepper, tugging impatiently at the leash. When she saw me, her face lit up in a smile. "There you are," she called, waving. "Max looks like he's ready to rule the world." I laughed as Max bounded toward Pepper, his tail wagging furiously. The two dogs greeted each other with playful barks, already chasing each other in circles before Ellie, and I even had a chance to say hello properly. "You've got to love their energy," I said, shaking my head as we started walking along the path. Ellie nodded, her smile warm. They're a good reminder to enjoy the little things. As we walked, the conversation turned to lighter topics: favorite movies, embarrassing childhood memories, the endless quirks of our dogs. But eventually, Ellie gave me a sideways glance, her expression softening. "How are you doing, really?" she asked. "You seemed a little off last time we talked." I hesitated, unsure of how much to share. But Ellie had a way of making it easy to be honest, her kindness like a gentle nudge in the right direction. "I saw Daniel a few days ago," I admitted, keeping my eyes on the path ahead. "It brought up a lot of stuff." Ellie's brow furrowed, but she didn't interrupt. She just nodded, her silence encouraging me to continue. "It made me realize how much I've been holding on to things that don't serve me anymore," I said, "and how much I've let that define who I am." Ellie placed a hand on my arm, her touch light but grounding. "That's a big realization," she said softly. "It sounds like you're finally letting yourself heal." I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. "I think I am. It's just hard." "Of course it is," Ellie said, her voice gentle. "But you don't have to do it alone." We spent the rest of the morning walking and talking, the conversation flowing effortlessly. Ellie shared her own stories, her messy breakup last year, the way she'd thrown herself into fostering rescue dogs as a way to cope. It wasn't just her words that resonated with me. It was the way she spoke, her voice steady and confident, as though she'd come out the other side stronger for it. By the time we parted ways, I felt a sense of connection I hadn't felt in a long time. Ellie wasn't just a casual acquaintance anymore. She was becoming a friend, someone who understood without judgment. That afternoon, as Max and I lounged on the couch, my phone buzzed with a text from Ellie. "Coffee tomorrow? Pepper needs her Max fix, and I think you and I could use some caffeine." I laughed, shaking my head at her straightforwardness. Max perked up, as if he knew he was being mentioned, and wagged his tail expectantly. "Looks like you've got a new best friend," I said, ruffling his fur. I texted back, "You're on." It was a small thing, meeting for coffee, but it felt like more than that. Felt like the beginning of something new, something good. The next morning, as I walked into the cafe and saw Ellie waving from a corner table, I realized how far I'd come in just a few short weeks. I wasn't waiting for Daniel to call or for my life to magically fix itself. I was choosing to take steps forward, however small. Ellie greeted me with a wide smile, a steaming cup of coffee already waiting for me. "I figured you might need this," she said, sliding it across the table. "Are you a mind reader?" I joked, taking a grateful sip. We spent the next hour talking and laughing, the conversation flowing easily. Ellie had a way of making everything feel lighter, as if the weight I carried wasn't as heavy when she was around. When we finally said goodbye, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time: joy. Back at the apartment, I sat on the couch with Max curled up beside me, my notebook open in my lap. I flipped to the page where I'd written my goals and added a new line. It wasn't easy opening myself up to others, but Ellie had shown me that it was worth the risk. There was a whole world out there, full of laughter, connection, and possibility, and for the first time I wanted to be part of it. I looked down at Max, who was snoring softly, and smiled. "We're going to be okay," I said, more to myself than to him, and this time I believed it. The cafe felt unusually quiet as I sat by the window, staring at the frothy swirl of my untouched latte. Outside, the world moved on, couples strolling hand in hand, cyclists weaving through traffic, the buzz of life continuing as if the weight pressing on my chest didn't exist. Ellie's words from earlier echoed in my mind. Healing isn't linear. Some days will feel harder than others. And that's okay. Today was one of those harder days. The day had started off well enough. Max and I had gone for our usual morning walk, and I'd met Ellie for coffee like we'd planned. We'd spent an hour laughing and talking about everything from her latest foster dog to the best way to stop Pepper from chewing on her shoes. It had felt normal, even good. But then my phone buzzed. I wasn't expecting the name that popped up on the screen: Daniel. I hadn't heard from him since that chance encounter at the park. Seeing his name now felt like a punch to the gut. My hands trembled as I picked up the phone, hesitating before swiping to open the message. "Hey Sophia. I've been thinking about you a lot lately. Can we talk?" That was it. No apology. No explanation. Just a simple request that left me feeling like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. Ellie noticed the change in my demeanor immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked, her brow furrowing with concern. "It's Daniel," I said quietly, sliding the phone across the table so she could see the message. "He wants to talk." Ellie's lips pressed into a thin line as she read the words. "How do you feel about that?" she asked, her voice gentle. I shook my head, trying to sort through the mess of emotions swirling inside me. "I don't know," I admitted. Part of me wants to ignore it, to just keep moving forward. But another part of me, I guess I'm curious. I want to know what he has to say. Ellie reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand over mine. "Whatever you decide, make sure it's for you, not for him." Later that evening, I sat on the couch with Max at my feet, staring at my phone. Daniel's message felt like a challenge, a test of how far I'd come. Ignoring it seemed easier, safer. But something in me knew that running from it wouldn't bring me the closure I needed. Taking a deep breath, I typed a response. "Okay. Tomorrow 2 p.m. at the park." I hit send before I could overthink it, the message disappearing into the ether. Max looked up at me, his tail thumping gently against the floor. "It's just a conversation," I said aloud. "As much for him as for myself. I can handle it." The next afternoon I stood by the pond, my hands buried in my jacket pockets to keep them from trembling. Max stood beside me, his leash slack in my hand, his calm presence grounding me as I waited. Daniel arrived a few minutes late, his usual confident stride tempered by hesitation. He looked almost the same as he always had, his dark hair slightly messy, his blue eyes scanning the area until they landed on me. But there was something different, too. A weariness that mirrored my own. "Hey," he said softly, stopping a few feet away. "Hey," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Max, ever the diplomat, wagged his tail cautiously, sniffing the air as if to assess the situation. For a moment neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy with all the things we'd left unsaid. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For everything. For leaving the way I did. For making you feel like you weren't enough." The words hung in the air, their weight sinking into me. I'd imagined this moment so many times, but hearing them now didn't bring the relief I thought they would. "I needed to hear that," I said, my tone measured. "But it doesn't change what happened." Daniel nodded, his expression somber. "I know. I guess I hoped that maybe we could try again. Start over." His words were a punch to the gut, but this time I didn't falter. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man I had loved, but also the man who had left me to pick up the pieces. "I'm not the same person I was back then," I said, my voice firm. "I've spent so much time trying to fix things, trying to make us work. But I can't do that anymore. I need to focus on myself now." Daniel's shoulders sagged. But he didn't argue. He just nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and understanding. "I get it," he said. "I really do." As Daniel turned and walked away, I felt a strange sense of lightness. It wasn't happiness exactly, but it was something close. A release. A step forward. Max nudged my leg, his tail wagging softly as if to say, "You did good." I crouched down and wrapped my arms around him, burying my face in his fur. "We're okay," I whispered. "We're really okay." For the first time I believed it. The day after my conversation with Daniel, I woke up feeling different. The heaviness that had lingered for so long wasn't gone, but it was lighter, manageable, as if something inside me had shifted, creating space where there had only been weight. Max was already awake, his golden tail wagging against the floor as he stretched and looked up at me with expectant eyes. "You ready for your walk, buddy?" I asked, scratching behind his ears. He barked softly, his way of saying always. The morning air was crisp as Max and I made our way to the park. The familiar path felt different today, like I was seeing it for the first time. The golden leaves that blanketed the ground, the soft chatter of birds overhead, the gentle sway of the trees. It all felt brighter, more alive. Max trotted ahead, his nose to the ground as he sniffed every leaf and blade of grass. I let him take the lead, content to follow and soak in the quiet. For the first time in what felt like forever. The silence wasn't suffocating. It was peaceful. As we rounded the corner by the pond, I spotted Ellie sitting on a bench, Pepper sprawled out at her feet. She waved when she saw me, her smile as warm as the sunlight filtering through the trees. "Look who decided to show up," she called, teasing. "Max, I think your mom was trying to ditch us." I laughed, shaking my head as I approached. Not a chance. Max would never forgive me. The three of us spent the morning walking the trails, the dogs chasing each other through the leaves while Ellie and I talked. She told me about her latest project at work, a fundraiser she was organizing for a local animal shelter, and I found myself genuinely interested, asking questions and offering ideas. "Why don't you come by the shelter sometime?" Ellie said as we looped back toward the pond. "I think you'd love it. And Max could always use some more dog friends." I hesitated, unsure if I was ready for that kind of commitment. But the thought of spending more time with Ellie, of being part of something bigger than my own struggles, was appealing. "I'll think about it," I said with a smile. Back at home, I spent the afternoon cleaning and organizing, something that had become part of my new routine. It was therapeutic in its own way, giving me a sense of control and accomplishment. Max followed me from room to room, his tail wagging as if he were supervising. When I finally sat down, the apartment felt more like home than it had in months. The vase of sunflowers on the kitchen table caught the afternoon light, their golden petals a cheerful reminder of the steps I'd taken toward reclaiming my space. I pulled out my notebook and flipped to my list of goals, adding a new line: embrace the little things. The next day, I decided to take Ellie up on her offer. Max and I drove to the animal shelter, where Ellie greeted us with her usual enthusiasm. The shelter was bustling with energy, volunteers walking dogs, staff chatting with visitors, and the occasional bark or meow breaking through the noise. Ellie introduced me to the team, and before I knew it, I was helping organize donations and walking a few of the shelter dogs. It was chaotic but fulfilling, and I couldn't help but smile as Max trotted alongside me, his tail wagging like he belonged there. "You're a natural," Ellie said as we wrapped up for the day. "You should think about coming back more often." "Maybe I will," I replied, surprised at how much I meant it. That evening, as Max and I sat on the couch, I thought about the day. For the first time in a long time, I felt secure, not in anyone else but in myself. I wasn't waiting for someone to fill the gaps or fix the cracks. I was doing it on my own, one small step at a time. I looked down at Max, who was snoring softly beside me, his golden fur glowing in the dim light. "We're doing okay, aren't we?" I said aloud. He didn't respond, of course, but the steady rhythm of his breathing was answer enough. I picked up my notebook and added another line to my list: find joy in giving back. The day began like any other. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the morning light streaming through the window. Max lay at my feet, his head resting on his paws, his tail thumping gently every time I glanced his way. I had started to enjoy these quiet moments, the stillness of the morning before the world rushed in. But today the quiet didn't feel comforting. It felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. My phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. I hesitated before picking it up, a sense of unease settling in my chest when I saw Daniel's name on the screen. "Hello." My voice was steady, but my heart raced as I pressed the phone to my ear. "Sophia." Daniel's voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Thanks for answering. I wasn't sure if you would." "I wasn't sure either," I replied honestly. "What's going on?" There was a pause on the other end, and I could hear him take a deep breath before he spoke again. I wanted to apologize. For everything. For the way I left, for the things I didn't say." His words hit me harder than I expected. For months I had been waiting for this, for some acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. But now that it was here, it didn't feel like the relief I thought it would. "I don't know if I can fix what I broke," Daniel continued, his voice breaking slightly, "but I want to try. If you'll let me." I closed my eyes, the weight of his words sinking in. For so long I had imagined this moment, replayed it in my head like a scene from a movie. But now it didn't feel like the happy ending I had once hoped for. It felt complicated, messy. "I appreciate the apology," I said finally, my voice calm but firm. But it doesn't change what happened. You left Daniel. And I had to figure out how to pick up the pieces on my own. I know, he said quickly. And I hate that I put you through that. I didn't know how to handle everything back then. But I've been working on myself, Sophia. I want to be better, for you, for us. I opened my eyes and looked down at Max, who was watching me intently, his tail wagging softly. His steady presence grounded me, reminded me of how far I had come. I don't think there's an us anymore, Daniel, I said, the words surprising even myself. I've spent so much time trying to fix things, trying to make us work. But I've realized that I deserve more than that. I deserve someone who doesn't need to leave to figure out how they feel. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that felt final, like the closing of a chapter. I understand, Daniel said quietly. I hope you know how much you mean to me. I do, I replied. And I hope you find the peace you're looking for. When the call ended, I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The weight that had been pressing on my chest for months felt lighter, as if I had finally let go of something I didn't even know I was holding on to. Later that day, I found myself back at the park, walking along the familiar trails with Max trotting happily beside me. The leaves crunched underfoot, and the cool breeze carried the faint scent of pine. It was a beautiful day, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could actually enjoy it. I sat on a bench by the pond, watching the ducks glide across the water. Max lay at my feet, his head resting on his paws as he gazed up at me with his warm brown eyes. I think we're going to be okay, Max, I said softly, scratching behind his ears. He wagged his tail in agreement, his silent reassurance comforting as always. I pulled out my notebook and flipped to the page where I had been keeping my list of goals. At the bottom I added a new line. Love myself enough to let go. That evening, as I curled up on the couch with Max by my side, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. The apartment, once a space filled with reminders of what I had lost, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where I could grow, heal, and rediscover who I was. Max let out a contented sigh, his golden fur glowing in the soft light of the room. I ran my fingers through his coat, a small smile playing on my lips. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for someone else to fill the gaps in my life. I wasn't looking for closure from Daniel or validation from anyone else. I was enough, and that was more than I had ever thought possible. The evening air was cool as Max and I walked along the quiet streets of the neighborhood. The stars above twinkled faintly, their light softened by the glow of street lamps. Max trotted beside me, his leash slack, his tail wagging in a steady rhythm. It had been a few days since the call with Daniel, and though the initial rush of emotions had subsided, I found myself reflecting on what it all meant. His apology, while sincere, hadn't changed the past, but it had given me something I hadn't realized I needed: permission to let go. That night, after Max had curled up on the couch, I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook open in front of me. The page stared back, blank and expectant, waiting for words I wasn't sure I could find. But then slowly they came. Dear Sophia, you've carried this weight for so long, this guilt, this anger, this sadness. It's time to put it down. Not for Daniel or anyone else, but for you. You've grown stronger than you ever thought possible. You've faced your fears, rebuilt your life, and found joy in the small things. You deserve to forgive not just him but yourself. As I wrote, the words felt like a balm, soothing wounds I hadn't realized were still raw. By the time I finished, tears blurred the ink on the page, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were something else. Relief, maybe. Or freedom. The next morning, I joined Ellie at the animal shelter. The air buzzed with energy, volunteers organizing supplies, staff chatting with visitors, dogs barking in excitement. It was chaotic, but in a way that felt alive and purposeful. Glad you made it, Ellie said, handing me a clipboard. You're officially part of the team now. I laughed, taking the clipboard and glancing at the list of tasks. You're not going to ease me in, huh? Nope, she said with a grin. You're too good at this already. As the day went on, I found myself immersed in the work, walking dogs, sorting donations, chatting with potential adopters. It felt good to be part of something bigger than myself. To give back in a way that didn't feel like an obligation but a gift. Max, ever the social butterfly, charmed everyone he met, his golden tail wagging furiously as he greeted staff and visitors alike. Watching him brought a smile to my face, a reminder of how much joy he had brought into my life. Later that afternoon, as we sat on a bench outside the shelter, Ellie turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You seem different," she said. "Lighter, maybe." I nodded, gazing out at the yard where Max and Pepper were playing. "I think I finally let go of something I didn't even realize I was holding on to." Ellie smiled, her eyes warm with understanding. "That's a big step." "It is," I said, my voice steady. "And it feels good. Like I can finally breathe again." She reached over and squeezed my hand, her touch grounding. "I'm proud of you, Sophia. You've come so far." That evening, as I sat on the couch with Max at my feet, I picked up the notebook again. Flipping to the page where I'd written the letter to myself, I read the words over, letting them sink in. Forgiving Daniel didn't mean forgetting what had happened. It didn't mean excusing the pain he had caused or pretending it hadn't left scars. But it meant releasing the hold those memories had on me, allowing myself to move forward without carrying the weight of resentment. And forgiving myself, well, that was the hardest part. But as I sat there, with Max snoring softly beside me and the apartment filled with the quiet hum of possibility, I realized that I had already started. The box in the closet had been sitting there for months, untouched since the day I'd packed it away. Tonight it felt like time to do something about it. I pulled it down and carried it to the kitchen table, the weight of it heavier in my arms than it had ever been on the shelf. Inside were all the relics of my life with Daniel, the photos, the mementos, the reminders of a love that had been both beautiful and flawed. One by one I took them out. Some I kept, placing them in a smaller box to store away. Others I let go of, setting them aside to donate or discard. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about creating space for the future. When I was finished, the box was lighter. And so was I. As I placed the smaller box back on the shelf, Max trotted over, his tail wagging gently. He looked up at me with his big brown eyes, his silent way of asking if I was okay. "We're good, Max," I said, crouching down to ruffle his fur. "We're really good." He barked softly, his tail thumping against the floor, and I couldn't help but laugh. It wasn't the kind of laughter that covered up pain or tried to fill silence. It was real, unguarded, and free. The first rays of sunlight peeked through the blinds, casting a warm glow across the apartment. The day felt new, full of possibility. I stretched, letting the early morning quiet seep into my bones. Beside me, Max stirred, his golden fur catching the light as he lifted his head and wagged his tail. "Good morning, buddy," I said, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. He barked softly, his way of saying let's get moving. The park was already alive with activity when Max and I arrived. Joggers passed by, their rhythmic steps blending with the chatter of children playing on the swings. Max bounded ahead, his energy infectious as he darted toward the pond where Ellie and Pepper were waiting. "You're late," Ellie teased as I approached, her smile warm and welcoming. "Max needed extra beauty sleep," I joked, earning a playful bark from him. Ellie laughed, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "I hope you're ready for today. Pepper's been dying to see her best friend." Max and Pepper immediately launched into their usual game of chase, their tails wagging furiously as they darted around the trees. Watching them, I felt a swell of gratitude for Max, for Ellie, for the quiet joy of moments like this. As we walked along the path, Ellie glanced at me, her expression thoughtful. "So, I've been meaning to ask you something." "What's that?" I asked, adjusting Max's leash as he sniffed at a patch of grass. "We're hosting an adoption event at the shelter next weekend," she said. "I think you'd be amazing at helping out. And I know Max would love it." The idea took me by surprise. But as I thought about it, a small smile tugged at my lips. "I'd love to," I said. "It sounds like a lot of fun." Ellie beamed. "I knew you'd say yes. It's going to be great." Later that afternoon, as Max and I returned home, I took a moment to look around the apartment. It felt different now. Less like a place filled with memories I was trying to escape from, and more like a space I could truly call my own. The sunflowers on the kitchen table were still vibrant, their golden petals a cheerful contrast to the clean, minimalist decor I had embraced. The framed photo of Max on the wall made me smile every time I looked at it, a reminder of how far we'd come together. I spent the rest of the afternoon rearranging the living room, adding small touches that reflected who I was now. A bright throw blanket, a new set of coasters, a stack of books I'd been meaning to read. It wasn't much, but it felt like me. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook open in front of me. The blank page felt like a fresh start, a space where I could lay down the final pieces of the past. Dear Daniel, I want you to know that I've forgiven you, not because you asked for it, but because I need it for myself. Holding on to anger and hurt was weighing me down, and I'm ready to let it go. I hope you find peace and happiness, just as I'm finding mine. Take care. Sophia. As I finished writing, a sense of calm washed over me. I didn't need to send the letter. It wasn't for him. It was for me. Max and I curled up on the couch that evening, the quiet hum of the apartment a comforting backdrop. I picked up one of the books I'd added to the stack earlier and began to read, letting the words transport me to another world. Max stretched out beside me, his head resting on my leg, his soft breathing a steady rhythm that grounded me. I ran my fingers through his fur, my heart full in a way I hadn't thought possible. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, I set the book down and looked out the window. The city lights sparkled in the distance, a reminder of all the possibilities that lay ahead. I wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt excited to find out. I pulled out my notebook and flipped to my list of goals. The words stared back at me, a testament to how far I'd come. Find my voice. Learn to let go. Stop waiting for Daniel to come around. Choose joy. Embrace the little things. Let new people in. Love myself enough to let go. Find joy in giving back. I added one final line. Keep moving forward. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, Max trotted beside me, his tail wagging softly. The apartment was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that felt heavy or lonely. It was peaceful, full of potential. As I lay down, Max curled up at my feet, his warm presence a comforting reminder that I wasn't alone. I closed my eyes, a small smile playing on my lips. Tomorrow was a new day, and I was ready for it.